It's Friday, February 24th, 2017. This is episode 68 of the Unseen Podcast. I am your host today. My name is Adam Smith. As you might guess from my accent, I am in England. I'm joined today by a talented trio of Americans. In New York, we have Sam Lichtenstein.
Hello from New York City.
Hey, Sam. Last time you and I met, Sam, you were in Hong Kong.
Yes, I've moved back to America, the land of the free.
You're watching the world's markets from the Big Apple.
Correct, yes.
You're not originally from New York, though, are you?
I'm from Boston originally, so transplant, but I still root for the Red Sox, so.
Okay. Welcome, Sam. And we also have with us in Washington, D.C., Dr. Ken Wisian. Hi, Ken.
Hello. And this is not my home area. I'm here on business.
Normally expect to find you in Texas.
Yep.
Enjoy your time in the capital.
Yeah, it's always an interesting place.
And down in Florida, we have Professor Antonio Paris. Welcome, Antonio.
Hey, guys. How you guys doing? It's beautiful here. We're in the 80s. It looks like we had a short winter that's already over.
Nice. So, Antonio, before we get into today's topic of discussion about your wonderful WOW signal experiment, you've been doing radio astronomy.
Yeah, that's correct. So for the last year and a half, we've been trying to determine what could have possibly been the source of the WOW signal, and we did a crowdsourcing campaign where we received $25,000. The experiment is over. The paper has been accepted by the astronomical community, and it's under blind peer review right now. We haven't received feedback, which is actually good news. Normally, if you don't hear from them from a while, that's actually good news. So we expect the paper to be published early spring, and hopefully the next podcast we'll be able to talk about those results.
Yeah, that's
great. Is it embargoed, or is there a preprint available somewhere?
Say that again?
Is it currently private, or have you posted a preprint of the text online somewhere?
The AAS told me not to do a preprint. It's in blind peer review, so once
yeah, different journals have different policies.
Yeah, once they give me a thumbs up before it's finalized, I'll share it once that happens. Normally, I get that about 2 weeks before they publish it. So,
okay.
Cool.
Well, I won't jinx the publication of your paper by congratulating you just yet. I will congratulate you on your resurrecting a radio telescope science with it, because I think that's wonderful.
Yeah, and what's great about this 10-meter telescope, it's we're using it now to look at gamma ray pulsars, so pretty neat.
Cool. I'm impressed.
Is that telescope in Florida?
It is. It's here in Central Florida, and we are the proud new owners of it. So we were able to put some money into it, refurbish it, add a new spectrometer, and it's working perfectly. Today we were looking at some Cygnus A, and it was just amazing, the signals that we were getting.
Was that just for the $25,000, or was there some other funding source?
No, that's
seems
it.
It seems like a bargain price for a powerful radio telescope.
Well, yeah, it's a multi-million-dollar telescope that was purchased by actually a private company, and they used it for telecommunications, and then it was basically abandoned for the last 10 years, and they offered it up basically for free as long as that we cleaned it up. So we cleaned it up and added some new wiring. So it's, it might need a new paint job right now. We had a really rough winter, so but it's still working. It's great. Saved us about $500,000.
That's no toy, is it? So, Ken, you and I first met last year.
Mm-hmm.
It's episode 65 of the podcast, and it was your first time. You introduced yourself, as you do, and you said that you are a recently retired Air Force general. You also have a PhD, and you said you're doing some work on first contact protocols, contact with extraterrestrial intelligence, which is awesome. Great. And I could have asked you to come on the show today to talk about that. I surprised myself that I didn't, and I still might. But today, I want to talk about flying because, well, things that fly. Insects, birds, balloons, rockets, and aeroplanes. And I kind of have a hunch that you don't get to the rank of general without having done a lot of flying.
So, is that your question? You're cutting in and out a little bit.
Yeah, sorry. So I was just saying that you don't think that you got to the rank of general in the Air Force without first having done a lot of flying. So I would like to talk about some of the aircraft that you've flown and learn about your role in the Air Force, because for someone like me, firstly, I'm not American, military, and if you live in a big town or a city, you very rarely ever get to see military aircraft. Ken's disappeared. Did I scare him off?
I think it's just
Antonio,
some connection difficulties. Here, I think he's back now.
Came back. And or y'all's.
I was saying, Ken, that when I approached you to do this show, I did so because I just had a hunch that you wouldn't have got to the rank, such a high rank in the Air Force, without having done a lot of flying.
Yes.
I really like
Chicken.
aircraft. So I thought I would invite you on some of the airplanes that you've flown on and some of the things that you did. My first question.
Story.
Well, before I start firing questions at you, I should also say that Antonio, you also have some military experience.
Yeah,
You're in
that's
the
correct.
Army?
Yes, I spent 10 years in the Army as an intelligence officer and was medically retired as a captain.
Which branch?
In the Army. I was in the Army.
Right. So, Ken, to begin with, I'd like to ask you if it was always your ambition to join the Air Force growing up. Was that always what you wanted to do?
Largely, it was. I was interested in military and flying, although not sports. And in fact, you mentioned rockets a little minute ago, and that reminded me that I think my first experience with my dad and I building model rockets when I was probably about range. And then going to air shows every few years really got me interested in the flying. But I also alternated between that and astronomy. And I went back and forth quite a bit all the way through college. And in my final year of college, I was in ROTC, that's officer training. And the final year, I switched from being in the scientist category in the Air Force flyer, just because I decided I had to fly.
Right.
And so that was it. Although I was already wearing these glasses, and I couldn't qualify as a pilot type. So I went in as a navigator. And so in the movies, I'm the guy in the back seat.
Right. Did you ever consider naval aviation or joining the Marines or the Army even?
Yes, I looked at all of them. Was that really, well, more that the Air Force was solely focused on flying, I think is what pushed me over. Because at different times I had scholarships from the Navy and the Air Force.
Did you have a pilot's license before you joined the Air Force?
No, I didn't. I'd taken one brief introductory flying course, but that didn't result in a license. So I went in the experience here, just in love with the idea of it.
So you joined straight from college?
Yes, I went to the University of Texas at Austin and commissioned straight into the Air Force, and then went to California for navigator and then B-52 training. And then I stayed on active duty for 10 years and then switched over to the National Guard, part of the reserve of the U.S. military. And
Right.
to get my PhD, but I wanted to keep flying.
I know that as a navigator, your job is to navigate, but can you tell us a little bit more about what a navigator actually does?
Yes, that's an old term too. Actually called that now in the Air Force. I think they're called combat systems operators or WISDOs. There came in, you still were really a navigator first. In fact, the few times I took B-52s over to England, that was done using celestial navigation over the Atlantic. And it was quite an interesting deal. I mean, it's now military, but the planes I was in, I kept doing celestial navigation all the way into the 90s.
Was that because
Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Was that because GPS was not yet able to support this type of mission, or because their Air Force was interested in having redundancies?
Both. Good point. When I started, my first operation that's basically nuclear warfare, so you can't count on a lot of the backup on the electronic navigation systems. So you had to be able to navigate using only what you had in the aircraft, which back then was a fairly primitive navigation and celestial and radar mapping of the ground below you.
How long did it take you to navigator and get your first posting?
It was a little over a year and a half. It go through about 9 months or so of navigator training, which is just general in nature, and then you get your assignment to what aircraft, in my case, B-52s. And then you go on to another 6 to 9 months of training in that aircraft and all its systems. Quite involved. There was interesting stuff in that aircraft, including a work of art mechanically and to keep track of your position. Really an amazing thing how it worked.
So
it would drift at
52,
multiple miles per hour, but it was still beautiful engineering.
B-52s are heavy bombers, right? So I assume this was back in the 80s. You must have carried nuclear weapons.
Yeah, there's one. I got to give one disclaimer that I didn't at the beginning. Nothing I say represents official military policy or position or any of that stuff. I am fully retired. But also, one of the things the military does, and again, you have a security clearance, you're told all this top secret stuff. There's no process I know of to let you know that it's been declassified and you can talk about it. So I won't go into details about what we did, but I did sit Cold War. It was from 83 to 89.
Yeah, which is just about right up until the end of the boat.
Yes. In fact, right about the time the Cold War ended is went off to test pilot school.
Wow.
And that's I could talk for an hour on that.
I'd like to ask you about that as well, but just on the subject of bombers, I think that precision guided munitions already were commonly used, and presumably nuclear weapons also have guidance systems. But as a navigator, were you responsible for targeting of ordnance?
Yes, and the B-52 had 6 crew members when I flew: pilots, there's an electronic warfare officer, and a gunner. And so I was one of the 2 navigators, and it's actually much like pilot, co-pilot. So I spent 2 years as a navigator and then upgraded to they're responsible for all the weapons and the aiming, the firing, all that stuff. And by the way, this will date me. All the way commissioned. I've seen a couple of them in museums. The models that are still flying are the H's. I flew G's.
Having a gunner dates you back to the at least the early 90s, I think, because they don't have gunners on B-52s anymore, do they?
Quite right. Yep, they took them out. When it gave up its what's called penetration role, they took the gunners out. But I remember one time the gunner let me fire the guns, and that's .450 caliber machine guns in the tail of the aircraft, and you can feel it through the whole aircraft when they fire.
Is the idea of the gunner that it's in case the bombers lost their fighter escorts?
Well, in most missions, the B-52s tended to fly. You wouldn't have. So the B-52 had to be able to take care of itself between the guns, which keeps off your tail, and your electronic warfare officer, who could put out thousands and thousands of watts of jamming.
Now, maybe this is too off topic, but did you ever get a chance to fly a stealth bomber successor to the B-52?
No, I did not, although I was pretty close to that. I, along with 2 other Strategic Air Command navigators were selected in 1990. And we were there and put in through test pilot school specifically to come out on the other end and do the test work and development on the B-2. We're at school. A 4-star general decided that the B-2 would be a 2-pilot aircraft instead of a 1-pilot, 1-navigator aircraft. And so I didn't go into it.
That's too bad.
So can you tell us about your time at...
what I do.
Can you tell us about your time at test pilot school?
Yes, that's definitely the flying highlight of my career. Test pilot school, I know this is Air Force test pilot school. There's also Navy test pilot school. And then France and England also have world-class schools. But I went through the Air Force test pilot school, and that's a year where they put you in as many types of aircraft as they can for years, along with what is now a master's degree in aerospace engineering. It wasn't at the time. Into academics on everything from propulsion systems to electro-optics, everything involved with aircraft. And during that time, again, you fly some specific aircraft as part of the course, but they also bring things. So I flew, that's where I got most of my fighter time. Flew F-4 Phantoms as part of the class, T-38s, which high performance trainers. Those were the 2 main aircraft. I flew everything from gliders to helicopters to big tanker aircraft. Flew helicopters with the Canadians. Flew some. It's just an amazing year. In fact,
it sounds like fun.
Yeah, sometimes you may get as little as a few hours notice that saying it. And the nice thing is, while you're in test pilot school, or once you have the graduate patch, you are legal to fly anything that you can get your hands on without training, which is good and bad. But your library, try to make sure you know enough to at least eject out of the aircraft.
Yeah.
Did you ever black out from excessive G-forces?
I never passed out, but especially coming from big aircraft, I wasn't used to pulling G's in the fighters. So it was tough for me to build up my endurance. But many times I can remember my vision going tunnel and then going completely out, but I could still hear and could fight my way back to getting my vision to open. So I never passed out, but I got pretty close a few times. I must say, pulling heavy G's, I didn't enjoy all that much. Going fast and low, yeah, that was a lot of fun. Rat racing through the Sierras, or the fastest I ever went was Mach 2, and that was with a future astronaut in the front seat of an F-4.
That's a Phantom.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a neat aircraft. It was right at the end of its lifespan when I flew it, and a little bit of a fire trap, but it had tremendous get up and go. On the high end, it could still outrun an F-16 because of the turbojet engines, big turbojet engines.
And that's served the role that's currently played by the F-22, or?
Mixture. It was a blend of everything. It was designed to do everything from interceptor to ground attack, somewhat like the F-16, with a little bit of maybe F-22 flavor in it. It was a Navy aircraft that the Air Force liked and bought in large numbers.
So
I'm curious whether Antonio has any experience of interacting with Army aviators in the intelligence role.
you're muted, Antonio.
There we go. There we go. Most of my time in the Army, and if I met any aviators, was usually on the Chinooks or on the Blackhawks, and that's just because I was in the infantry, Army Ranger, and I had a lot of drops. As a paratrooper, we did a lot of jumps from the C-130s and occasionally from Chinooks out of Fort Bragg, but most of that stuff was quick tactical operations, not much engagement with either the pilots or the crew members, especially as a lieutenant or a captain. So I had my share. I had my share in the helicopters and some some rotary wing, but not necessarily didn't pull any G's like Ken did here.
Were your units already relying upon unmanned aerial support for intelligence and other?
No, I got out in 2007, and right about that time, we some of the information, I don't like to use intel, but some of the information we got were from Predator drones and other UAVs. But it was the transition from standard collection platforms to mostly now UAVs. Was mostly right after 2007 when I was transitioning out of the Army. So, my intel was mostly human and some SIGINT. But today it's all overhead collection, and even the smallest drones now can be operated at the tactical platoon level. So it's been a big technological advancement in just almost 10 years since I got out.
Yeah, Antonio, most of my second half of my career was flying slick C-130s, and I took a lot of guys out the back end. Personally, I'm quite happy to stay with a flying aircraft.
Airborne was fun. You get after so many jumps, your knees and your feet start to give up. So I didn't go to air assault school. I should have did that instead. Coming down the ropes. But it's a great memory. I love the military. I probably would have stood in if I wasn't injured. But it's I guess it's humble that you're able to experience these things and be able to participate and be part of these operations and board some of these aircraft. It's pretty cool. So,
did you ever witness any of the B-52 shock and awe campaigns?
I did not. My time in Afghanistan and Iraq was mostly through either armored brigade or light infantry. I probably remember hearing a lot of the ordnance coming down either from artillery or from the aircraft, which are loud, obviously. But I've seen B-52s overhead, but I've not. Never stepped on board one or, a lot of those stuff are Air Force things, and you don't really get to see that from a military installation that's controlled by the Army.
Mm-hmm. So, Ken, you qualified as a test navigator. Go on to test.
My test work was all AC-130 gunships and MC-130 Talons. The gunships, I think most people have seen pictures of them with the big cannons shooting out the side. It's a lot of fun to shoot a 105 millimeter howitzer out of a C-130.
That's an incredible
no doubt about
feat.
that. And in the Talon, that was personally my favorite C-130. That's a special mission 130 designed to take special forces in and out of zones, but it had a beautifully done and integrated cockpit. It had terrain following radar, nice defensive suite. That one was a lot of fun.
The Talon's the one with the big nose.
Yes. The one I flew was, and that's because of the extra radars it had in it.
So I have a very naive question. I knew that you flew C-130s, and so I was looking into the history of that aircraft and that family of aircraft. What explains why it's so great? It must be pretty great if it's lasted for more than 60 years now. So what is it that, it's not the fastest, it's not the biggest payload, but somehow it's stuck around for a surprisingly long period of time.
And amazingly, the production line is still going with what are called J models. I never flew them as a crew member, but my last tour in Afghanistan, I flew a couple mission on J's, just they're coming in, and they were significantly nicer than the H models that I flew. But the longevity of the C-130, it's a lot like the old DC-3 C-47. It's really rugged. It's overbuilt and overdesigned. And that's the bulk of it. You're right. It's not fast. It's not the roomiest. Nowadays, it doesn't have the easiest maintenance, but it also has that momentum of having so many already been built. It's kind of like PCs versus Macs. It's the dominant aircraft. Its parts are available. They're flown all over the world. But the people that fly them love them because they're really rugged. I've taken them in to dirt strips at like 10,000 feet in Afghanistan, blacked out at night on night vision goggles, and that's an amazing experience.
So from the Pentagon's perspective, a low total cost of ownership is probably attractive. But you're saying the pilots appreciate a lack of maintenance headaches more than anything else.
Yes. I wouldn't specifically say lack of maintenance headaches, but its ability to just keep going and its ruggedness. So again, a lot of aircraft transports have been advertised as being able to land on dirt and rock and grass, but a lot of them, you really don't want to do that. The C-130, you do that regularly. It's got those high up engines, so you're not sucking dirt and rocks up into it.
Can I ask you about the AC-130? It's got those huge guns on the side. I mean, it's got a huge howitzer that must have an incredible recoil.
Well, it's actually pretty well damped. It's not as severe inside the aircraft as you'd think. I mean, you feel it. It's an impulse, kind of like a gentle shove, I would say. What could really drive the aircraft was in the model I flew was the 25 millimeter Gatling gun up towards the nose. And that was a continuous thrust because it would fire, I don't remember how many thousands of rounds a minute, but all those 25 millimeter slugs going out the side pretty far forward would force the pilot to step on the rudder to keep the plane straight. Otherwise, that gun would drive the nose off to the right.
I've read somewhere that some of the new 130s are actually without pilots, something like drones. Have you heard about that yet?
No, I haven't heard about that. But I mean, you can configure any aircraft to fly remotely. So it wouldn't surprise me at some point, but I haven't heard of that on C-130s. The type of missions they do, not as conducive to being an RPA, a remotely piloted aircraft, as a lot of other missions.
Okay.
Now, going forward after this generation of fighters, the F-22 and F-35, and even potentially the next generation of bombers, might all be designed to be optionally crewed. So depending on the mission and the risk, you might put a crew in it or you might fly it remotely. And I think that will be common for the next generation of aircraft.
Later in your career, were you involved in kind of strategic decision making in the Air Force in terms of things like transitioning to UAVs or remotely piloted aircraft?
Two things on that. One, when I got a wing command, it was a Predator wing. So I commanded a wing of drones for a couple of years. But as far as the strategic work goes, no. I was a general in the National Guard part. So my command as a general was the state of Texas Reserve Force, the Texas Air National Guard. So my main fight was budgetary, personnel allocations, that kind of stuff. So I was on the what you'd call the force provider end. There's a lot of different roles, but much of the Air Force or any of the part of the military day to day is force provider. So you're responsible for training, keeping people ready to go, that kind of stuff.
Was commanding a Predator wing a big change of pace from your previous experience?
Yeah, huge. I went from a C-130 group to a Predator wing on just a few days' notice. And yeah, that's a totally different thing where, you're in the U.S., you drive to work in the morning, you brief up, and then you sit down and you're over Iraq or Afghanistan for the next 8 hours flying a combat mission. It's very different, and it's a different set of challenges to when I've deployed to the war. That's the only thing you do. You're over there. You have to leave your problems behind as much as possible, and you're doing it for months at a time. In the Predator world, you're doing that every 24 hours. You're going back to your family or to your home or the problems, or you're stressed out from driving the drive, and you just have to what we call recage your brain that, okay, now I'm sitting down and I'm in Afghanistan, or I might even be plugging right into a firefight.
Is it strange for the pilots flying an aircraft over Afghanistan or wherever while they're thousands of miles away? It must be is there a kind of a disconnect, or is it just a matter of that's their job and they get on with it, or is it kind of disconnected?
Yes to all of that. Although I think the disconnect is fairly brief when you're first learning to do it. And let me clarify so some of my old buds won't get mad at me. I commanded a Predator wing. I was not a Predator crew member. I qualified in another aircraft, a manned surveillance aircraft that same wing flew. Because as a wing commander, you have to be qualified in one of the aircraft that the wing flies. But my knowledge is based from spending lots of time in there and working the problems and such. But, nowadays, most of the drone pilots are only trained to do that. They're not even qualified to fly an aircraft in the first person. So that's all they've ever known. And that's what the whole younger generation is like. My unit had fairly recently transitioned, and we had everything from Coast Guard helicopter pilots, previous Air Force fighter pilots, and every background you can imagine was now a Predator pilot. And it was pretty interesting to see how those different backgrounds fit into the mission.
I've seen some footage of Predator strikes on targets on the internet, And it's always apparent to me that people on the ground have got absolutely no idea they're going to have a very bad day. So
it's really old school stealth. It's such a small aircraft with a small engine flying fairly high up that even if you know one's overhead, it's extremely difficult to spot it.
Antonio.
So I work with artificial intelligence systems a lot in my job in finance, and I'm curious about, so setting aside the command and control aspect for individual targeting decisions, which I think probably will remain something with a human in the loop for the foreseeable future. When it comes to piloting and navigation, sort of most of the man hours involved in piloting a Predator mission, I imagine, go to those things. Are those things mostly automated at this point, do you think? Have the computers taken it over, or is there still a big role for the human drone operators?
At this point, there's still a big role. The technology still needs someone watching over it pretty closely. Yes, you generally fly them by programming in where you want them to go, as opposed to doing a lot of stick and rudder work. So yes and no, the technology is advancing fast, and I've been out of that world for over 5 years now. So I know that it's active research, but I don't know exactly where that stands now. But the Air Force is definitely interested in that because they would like to lessen the intense need for a whole crew for every one of those all the time. And if you could,
does that give you any mixed feelings as a pilot about whether the Air Force would dramatically reduce its staff of trained pilots?
A little bit, but you can't let your sentimentality get in the way of mission effectiveness. And I get asked a lot, well, are we going to do away with manned aircraft entirely? No, I don't think so. There's still many missions that need someone right there, at least for the foreseeable future. And especially if you're hauling people in the back of the aircraft, I personally want someone with their skin at risk in the front of the aircraft.
I always have mixed feelings about that, whether I trust the pilot more than the fly-by-wire. Well, especially when it comes to landing in tricky situations.
Well, and that's actually a very valid point. The comfort factor is probably psychological as much as anything. I was just reading today that the accident rate on Teslas with the autopilot is already looking to be about 40% better or lower than cars without an autopilot. And you probably apply the same thinking to aircraft in general.
But then, you hear these amazing stories about the one I heard most recently was, some commercial jetliner pilot who a meteorite struck the cabin window and, just took it right in stride, followed his training, landed the plane, that's the sort of thing where you might think that the software would not be programmed to handle such edge cases very gracefully. And so it's a good thing there's someone with the right training there to do and take things under control.
A long ways to go before it can meet general human intelligence, the ability to adapt to anything that happens. I mean, witness the miracle on the Hudson with Skullenberger. I mean, that's kind of the pinnacle of human piloting. Well,
as a non-pilot, I'm obviously very impressed, but is that more or less impressive for somebody who is training flying large aircraft like that?
No, it's still impressive. Very much so. Yeah. And you still don't get better training than the military training is on, especially focused on handling emergencies. The military spends a lot of time and effort training you to react and handle any emergency in a very disciplined manner. And I mean, that's what paid off with Sullenberger, and I've seen it paying off in flight.
Talking about military training, Antonio, about your training, because the Rangers are not your average infantry outfit, are they?
I would say they're a little more advanced training, and they're specialized in I don't like to use the word special operations, but in areas where an advanced requirement is required. So, for example, most of the stuff we've done was, for example, we took over Talil Air Base, which was in Iraq. So more strategic operations where we would go in, take a hold of a strategic piece of ground, and then the infantry would infantry would roll in and secure that from us. So it's kind of like the intermediary. You know, you have your special forces, and then you have your standard infantry, and somewhere in the middle is where the Rangers fall in for very unique, very quick operations. Not necessarily clandestine or covert like you would have with the Green Berets or Delta and things like that. But it was interesting. For me, it was training was not that difficult, only because I spent the better part of almost 2 to 3 years in Fort Benning doing the training. So initially I went into basic training, which was all of this was at Fort Benning. So we had basic training, and then I had officer candidate school, and then infantry officer basic school, and then airborne, and then something what they call pre-ranger. And so by the time I was already with pre-ranger, I was about a year and a half of just doing infantry training, so that when I went to ranger school, most of the cadre were people that I've already dealt with, and it was just a redundant training from infantry school and OCS. It was a little tougher, but it wasn't that bad. You know, it's an 8-week course, and you're coming from 4 different schools back to back. So you're already in good shape. If I was to go to ranger school today, I would flunk within 2 minutes. But when you're 22 in your prime, and it's just a whole different ballgame. But it was fun. I still have some friends who are they're lieutenant colonels by now, and they're still in the Ranger brigades. You know, having a good time.
And let me jump in there too. The Flyers get ribbed a lot for having life pretty easy, and actually that's true. One thing I've learned, at least from my perspective, it's a lot better to be flying over the battlefield than to be on the battlefield. So my hat's off to the guys on the ground. These wars, the Flyers haven't faced too serious threat beyond the first few days of the Iraq War. So, you know, hats off to someone on the ground that has to deal with that day to day. I remember I had to convoy across Kabul one time for a special mission, and it's not something you're trained for. And so for a flyer driving at breakneck speed across a busy city, armed to the teeth, that was unnerving. I'd like much better to be in the air and be in the environment you're trained for.
Yeah, I agree. I was never comfortable, you know, being, you know, every time spending most of my time in the infantry, and then spending my last year and a half in a staff position. It is completely different.
I was going to ask you, Ken, did you ever get shot at in your C-130?
Not that I know of, but let me caveat that. In the daytime, C-130 doesn't have good visibility out of it. So in the daytime, usually you don't know you're being shot at until holes start to appear in the aircraft. At night, with night vision goggles, yeah, you see anybody shooting for miles around. So I was never shot at that I know of. I did have one aircraft, one of my crews on a deployment got their aircraft riddled a few times, but no one hurt. And then we also had one aircraft get mortared on the ground. But that was the biggest threat we faced.
Right.
Antonio, did your Ranger training cover radio telescope repair, or do you learn that separately from the Army?
No, radio telescope came through a good friend of mine called Dennis Farr, who was actually a retired communications technician with the Navy. So, and who became an amateur astronomer. So I bumped into him here in Tampa about 3 years ago, and it was, he's this guy's just phenomenal, Dennis, and he basically stripped out. I learned through him, and he basically stripped down all the interior of this radio telescope. I mean, he gutted stuff that the equipment was easily from the 60s and 70s. And a company out of Texas called Radio Astronomy Supplies is the one that provided us with all the modern equipment. So Dennis just basically replaced everything. Where the radio telescope's located is owned actually by a guy named Ed, and Ed is a technician for Blue Origin, I think that new space company, and he builds telemetry equipment for them. And so through him, Dennis and I, we basically just refitted this entire telescope, and it took us about a year, but it's pretty cool. It's working now, and.
But so not standard Army kit bag.
No,
material.
definitely not standard Army kit. But I've learned a lot. Yeah, so it's pretty cool.
Hey, astronomy was what I wanted to go into, and I got a bachelor's in physics.
Yeah.
But I realized that I wasn't a good enough physicist to be an astronomer or astrophysicist.
Well, when I was in Ranger school, infantry school, and I would be out in the field just looking at the stars because there's almost no light pollution out there. I always knew that's what I wanted to do. I would sit down with my squad, and in my rucksack, I always had this little astronomy book that I'd take with me, and it was just pretty, looking back now, and I used to just read under the stars with my little red flashlight. That could have been what inspired me to become an astronomer, but I always knew that something that I always wanted to do.
My best experience as an undergrad, I got to work at McDonnell Observatory in West Texas for a summer after my freshman year, and that was so much fun. And scam any unclaimed time on the 30 and 36 scopes.
Yeah, a friend of mine, Nicole, has been to that observatory, and she said that it took her hours of driving across Texas, and then it's absolutely in the middle of nowhere. Is that right?
Pretty much, and I think it still has some of the darkest skies available. And they've built some new stuff up there recently too.
You want to get the observatory away from light pollution, so it's usually an hour or two away from anything.
I had the chance to go to the Australian outback last summer, and that was the darkest sky I've seen in my entire life. I haven't been out to West Texas though, so maybe it's comparable to that. But
there's a funny story about that telescope. In the 1970s, one of the astronomers went a bit crazy and shot up the mirror with a shotgun. I think.
Yep. Actually, I think it was a pistol, because I walked right up to the glass there when they've had the telescope down, and there's mainly one chip in it, which they say they'll never fix, and it had negligible effect. But yeah, it's a true story.
Yeah. So, can you tell us about in Texas? What you mentioned that you flew some sort of reconnaissance aircraft. What was that?
that was a fairly little known aircraft called an RC-26. It's a twin turboprop Fairchild Metroliner with a pretty nice sensor ball and suite in it, just designed to do surveillance work. And most of what I flew was actually on the Mexican border, augmenting law enforcement. So it was one of those National Guard roles where you can augment law enforcement. So we did that, did other counter drug work around the state. But what was interesting, I thought, was actually, and the skill sets for that were the same you needed in the predator world. So we would try to cycle people through and spend a little time in the manned aircraft, a little bit in the pred.
Right. You told me previously that you were involved in the search and rescue for the Columbia space shuttle crash. Can you tell us about that?
Okay. Well, first of all, spending time out at Edwards Air Force Base, when I was out there, that was where the shuttle always landed, and you got used to hearing the double sonic boom. And even if you're asleep, you could wake up in time to go outside and watch it come in. So I got kind of used to doing that. And then also, people ahead of me, people in my class, people behind me, faculty, all went on to be astronauts. So I had fair connections with the program. Then, years later, I'm stationed in Texas flying C-130s. And I knew the shuttle was coming in that day. And I remember looking at whatever the live feed was and going, that contrail doesn't look right. And so I basically got in my car and started driving into the base, which is about 30 minutes away. And by the way, by this point, I'd already been a finalist for NASA astronaut in '99. So I'd known a little bit more about the program. So I drove into the base, and another guy who had been an astronaut finalist, Bill Spiesman, showed up there, along with other people started showing up just because they kind of had a feeling that it wasn't right. And sure enough, pretty quickly, we got a call from Washington say, get an aircraft in the air, get over East Texas and see what you can find. And so we launched the C-130 with minimal support and got up in the air and got over East Texas. And we were the first aircraft on scene, or simultaneously. A pair of F-16s showed up also. I don't remember where they were from, probably either Houston or from Fort Worth. But we basically divvied up the space and started flying over. And all we could see all over East Texas were little trails of smoke coming up out at random intervals. So what we did was start flying over them, marking their coordinates, and then radioing and relaying them to a command center. And we did that for, I don't remember how long, I think about an hour, maybe a little more, until some actual search and rescue craft started to arrive. But, for that brief time, we were the first people on scene, and I was the mission commander for it. It's not a happy time, but it's something you'll never forget, especially having, tangentially been close to the program.
Were you acquainted with any of the crew members?
Not on that one, thankfully, but it's like anytime you see an aircraft crash, you still just, it gets to you. You can think, I've had my close calls. It's just tough to see, but especially something that at that level where you got people that have worked so hard, trained so hard to be in that position, and the world's watching them, and their families are watching them. So it's tough. And it was particularly poignant to have, two people who gotten as far as finalists for astronaut in the plane doing the search and rescue.
Must have been a very bad day.
Yeah, definitely so. But, at the same time, I think the public and maybe even some parts of NASA had taken things for granted. Going up into space is still high risk, and it will be. These missions to Mars that have been contemplated, they're pretty darn high risk.
I expect that in missions to Mars, certainly, I think there will be people are going to die. That's it. And I guess as an astronaut, you accept those high risks.
Yeah.
You must.
Yeah. If I were younger, I'd sign up for a Mars mission now. Even realizing that I think it's probably a one-way mission.
Have you followed the interplanetary transport system plan that Elon Musk put out? I'm just curious because part of the design is to have a Mars entry vehicle that has a lifting body structure. So the entry will be something that they'll need a pretty skilled pilot to pull off, I would imagine. But I wonder whether you have any thoughts on that.
I'm not really familiar with the details of it, so I couldn't say.
I'm not sure there are very well
Mars
fleshed out
atmosphere is super thin. It's only about 1% the density. So it'd be an interesting lifting body. And
I'm not that familiar with the details myself, but
yeah, I mean, I love what he and the other private companies are doing. Just keep pushing the boundaries and think big. I think it's fantastic. I'd love to be associated with them in some way, but I just like to see them do it and the remarkable success. I mean, look at what they've done in a relatively short time, where now they're reasonably reliably sticking a landing for the main stage after launch. That's really something.
Yeah, I watched the launch and the landing of the first stage just a few days ago. It's still amazing to watch. Really, really impressive.
it looks a lot like a movie.
It reminds me of Thunderbirds, the old
Exactly.
show. It does, but it's not.
You're dating yourself.
Yes. I was going to ask you guys about danger, because being a test navigator, I would imagine, is a very dangerous job. And being a United States Ranger is also an extremely dangerous occupation. Are you ever conscious of just how dangerous your situation is, or do you just get on with it and do your job?
I think it's a combination of both. When at a young, when you're a young, infantry officer, fresh out of school, the priority is keeping your subordinates safe as possible. But I didn't really. I wasn't scared when I was in combat. I've been in combat several times, Iraq and Afghanistan, 5 times total. And we've had mortars come down on us, machine gun fire, light arms. Nothing bigger than that, but close enough where some of the people that I was with were injured. But yeah, I think about it now. I probably would have done things a little differently. I still would have been a ranger, but I probably would have kept my head down a little lower. But yeah, there are risks involved in those things. I felt that we had a very competent, brigade and battalion commanders and company commanders that were making the right decisions and making sure that we were put in harm's way.
Yeah, for my part, I think a lot of it is just being young. Psychologically, you don't feel the danger as much as when you're older. And also a lot of it is you don't get that scared feeling until just after the threat has passed, at least for me. test flying, yeah, that was, in a lot of ways, that was probably more dangerous than my combat flying. I did over 70 hours of what are classified as a medium or high risk test flights. But you also plan those to death, almost to the point of taking all the fun out of it. Because you have weeks and weeks of safety reviews and all kinds of stuff that go into it. But, did some interesting things. The first fire of the guns out of a brand new C-130 or taking aircraft from the factory that haven't flown before, or on the Talon doing 3-engine terrain following tests. So you're running at a mountain on 3 engines and testing the algorithms that are in the flight computers on how to safely avoid the terrain with limited thrust. Or actually the highest risk mission was the first testing of the Talon, and this is the Talon 2, doing hands-off terrain following in the weather. So you're flying at 300 feet and you can't see the ground, and you're letting the radar fly the plane through the terrain. So that was probably the single highest risk mission I did. And then the rest of my career, twice in the B-52, I armed my ejection seat and was within just a second or so of leaving, but didn't.
What about in helicopter flights? My understanding is that there is no option to eject in a helicopter. So if there's a problem, you have to land it on fire or whatever the situation might be.
Yep. And it's a little more dangerous. I know in Edwards, shortly after I'd flown with one of the helicopter crews, they had a catastrophic mechanical failure and lost the crew.
When you eject in a B-52, do you go upwards or do you go?
4 people go up, 2 people, the 2 navigators go downwards out the bottom of the aircraft. So, that was rather unique, having a downward ejection seat. It was designed for high altitude strategic bombing, and the low level mission was an adaptation. But you had to have altitude to eject. So if you had a problem on takeoff, you were in a lot of trouble. And that was one of the 2 times I'd armed my ejection seat. The upstairs guys sometimes referred to us as high-speed chalks, because if you eject on the ground, you're just going to be the block that the tires stop on. I know it. Antonio's got to leave in a few minutes, right?
Yes, I have to leave in about 1 more minute. I have another podcast here soon.
Oh wow! What was your scariest jump?
I've first heard one.
Nighttime jumps are pretty bad. What's that?
My first one.
Oh, okay.
And that's I'll end it there. It's a really good story. So, so when we go on the flight line, I was last. And I said, oh, this is going to be good. I'll be the last one jumping out. But I didn't realize as we boarded the C-130, I was last. Once we got on board, they made us do an about face. And then I realized, wait a minute, I'm the first one. So the officers are always first. So I realized really quickly, this is going to be really interesting. So we did the about face, and it was just natural. We did so much training that when that green light came on and the jump master said go, I didn't even think. I just went out. I remember seeing a bunch of cows, and then landed safely and did my PLF. And after that, it was pretty routine.
Had you done a joint jump with an instructor before that as part of training, or that was literally your first?
No.
Wow.
You do a lot of mock jumps on these towers at Fort Benning. They're maybe about 100 feet high, and that's it. It's all, you know. They teach you how to fall and roll. That's called the PLF, and you do that about 200 times. That by the time you do your first jump, that's instinct. So that when you pull and you land, you automatically do what they trained you, which is to, roll to your side, and that's all I remember. You know, it was just funny. I was like about face, and I was like, oh god, I'm gonna be the first one. And but that's what officers are. Officers are always the first ones out the door, and after that, after your 10th, 20th, 30th jump, it's just routine.
Yeah, the military doesn't do that tandem first jump thing where you're attached to someone. It's
No, we don't do that. No, we didn't.
But
do that.
it is static line.
Yeah, it's all static.
That's a lot.
Well, guys, I got to go here in a minute. I got another call here in 8 minutes. So it was great talking to you guys.
Yeah, enjoyed it.
Antonio.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Antonio. Thank you
All
for
right,
your
guys.
time.
Have a good one.
Okay, thank you.
So I have a bit of a random question. I don't know whether either of you will have thoughts about this, but I'm just thinking that I've been following the civil war in Syria for the last, I guess, several years now. You know, it's been going on since 2011 or so. And it's an interesting war insofar as air power has been a feature of the war since the beginning, and yet it hasn't been decisive in the way that we think of air power as a decisive feature of modern American war. I wonder whether it's sort of watching recent events in the Middle East and Libya, Syria has had any effect on how people think about the role of air power going forward in the future. It's a broad question, I know, and I'm not an expert, but maybe you have thoughts, either of you?
I'll give it a stab. The role and decisiveness of air power is a perpetual debate. In the right circumstances, it can be very decisive, but particularly in urban and more guerrilla style, the chances of it being decisive are probably lower. It's a supporting function most of the time. And particularly in the current wars, it's been, in the most recent ones for the U.S., it's been a supporting function in that almost everything we do is in tactical support of the ground forces. It's not strategic, like trying to knock out the central government or the power grid, that kind of stuff. But it within the military, that's always a hotly debated topic.
Yeah.
The Army often wants to say, we don't need the Air Force. The Air Force goes, yeah, you do. Yeah, you do. So it's part friendly rivalry. It's part budget fighting for resources. But there's legitimate debate, and I think it's an open question on when can air power be the decisive factor. Probably the most extreme example is Bosnia, where some people will say that air power won the war clean and simple, but even that one gets debated.
There's no doubting that air power played a very decisive role in the Gulf War, or the two Iraq wars. But in Syria and Iraq at the moment, one of the biggest problems is identifying the combatants and distinguishing between civilians and non-civilians. And that, I guess, that can only be done on the ground.
Or perhaps with more advanced remote sensing technology.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's done through a combination of people on the ground and good sensors in the air. And we do better than anyone else ever has in history up to this point, but it's always going to be a tough issue. Probably the biggest lesson, especially from the first Gulf War, was you're foolish to take on a first line military, namely the U.S. military, in a wide open environment with conventional forces, because it was just a turkey shoot on the Iraq forces. And to a large degree, the ground troops were mopping up on an enemy that was pretty badly beat up at that point. So a lot of countries learn that lesson, I think, and deliberately try to complicate that friend or foe or neutral separation issue.
Can I ask you your opinion about the new F-35? Are you a fan?
Or the long-range strike bomber, for that matter.
Well, we need them. The F-35 clearly has teething problems. This is strongly just personal opinion, but our acquisition system hasn't figured out how to develop modern weapon systems in a timely manner. It's tough. We essentially program in engineering breakthroughs on these modern, at least on the aircraft weapon systems. I mean, you're really pushing out beyond current technology when you're designing them and establishing the program. So you have that factor. You have the software issue. The immense amounts of software that go into a modern weapon system are frequently a major bottleneck. And, how do you solve that problem? There's not that many talented programmers. Even back in the 90s in the gunship, when I was working on that, the software was a major bottleneck. So, will the F-35 become a good system? Yeah, I think so. How long it'll take and how much more money, I don't know. The F-16, which is now a great aircraft, was at first known as the Utah lawn dart because it had a tendency to just suddenly pitch down and run into the ground. And, it was I think it was the first full production fly-by-wire aircraft, and it had some fatal teething errors in it. And I don't know how you avoid that.
You've flown on F-16s?
I've got about, I think about 20 hours. So not a lot of time, but that's been some of my most fun experiences, though.
All I would want to do is look out the window. But I guess you don't have time to do that.
Well,
do you have time to take in the view and enjoy it?
You get moments. I think the F-16 is going to go down. I think the F-16 is going to go down as probably one of the most fun aircraft to fly in history, right up there with things like the F-86, the P-51, and others. Just because, one, it's small. Two, you're way out in front of the aircraft in the nose. The canopy comes way down, like mid to lower chest level. So it really feels like you're out just in space with it. Plus, when you're flying, you're hardly moving your hands and stuff as you control the aircraft. Just uniquely fun in a way that I don't think even the F-22 and F-35 are. And I'm sure their pilots would hotly debate that. But you're sitting a little lower down. You're a little more encased. You got more stuff around you. The F-16 is more like, as close as you would ever get to an open cockpit aircraft in the jet age. But
was it a tight squeeze for you to get into an F-16?
I'm sorry, say it again.
Was it? You were you're a big guy. Was it a tight squeeze to get into an F-16?
It's snug, but a pretty big guy can get into it, and I didn't have any real problem being in it. The only aircraft I ever had a problem was the A-37/T-37. That's an old trainer, side-by-side jet trainer for the aircraft. And in test pilot school, we had to do a lot of spins in that, including inverted spins, where you tumble the aircraft upside down and it's just kind of spinning around. I could never tighten my seatbelts enough to where when you're upside down spinning, that my head wasn't punched up against the canopy, forced up against the canopy, just going, trying to do the maneuvers to come out of the spin. But that was the only aircraft I ever had a problem with my height with.
The T-37 is the one with a big kind of bubble canopy.
Yes. Yep. And it has many nicknames, including the dog whistle, because its engines are so high pitched. But it's a fun little aircraft, except when you're upside down and your head's hitting the canopy.
So you were clearly able to fly, all the most modern aircraft with no problem, despite wearing glasses. Mm-hmm. So what's the deal with the vision requirement for pilots? Is it just an obsolete relic from an earlier age, or?
Well, as far as like glasses go, somewhat. Although, frankly, I think glasses are a hindrance if you're pulling a lot of G's. They can get in the way a little bit. But, for instance, the Air Force now allows you to have the eye surgery to correct your vision and such. For a long time, they didn't. But you do need that 20/20 or better vision. That is an important factor. It's been established early in the flying business last century and reestablished multiple times since then, that not having perfect eyesight will result in more accidents. And particularly in air-to-air fighting, that especially when you got better than 20/20, it's an advantage to be able to pick up the other guy first visually. Now, yes, you've got radar systems and all that, but if you move past a radar or missile engagement into a dogfight regime, eyesight can make a big difference. And that was also seen in World War II, where the ability to see the other guy first was a huge advantage. So you need perfect vision. How you get there, and especially if it's not in a fighter, no, it's not a problem. And even when I was in, you only had to have 20/20 vision the first day you showed up at pilot training. Your eyes could go down after that. It's just, I think in a roundabout way, you did kind of hit it. It was something of a weed out, mm-hmm. But it still has a good basis.
And what about for astronauts? What do you have any regrets about not qualifying, or
no?
Or do you have any idea
my
why?
path was great. I was doing pretty good, and I think I had a good chance of making it. But at the time, I was a single parent. Mm-hmm. I realized how intense the training was going to be.
The time commitment was
be a single parent and get through astronaut training. So I pulled myself out.
Oh, I see.
But on the other hand, I wouldn't have made it to general if I'd have gone the astronaut route. And, I got to play in 3 wars. So it was a good route.
So it's not the case that every sort of high-level pilot wants to be an astronaut. There's kind of a career path decision you make at some point about whether to go into officer leadership or various other choices.
Yes. And, for astronaut in particular, test pilot school is the lead in. It's a little less so now, but still most astronauts are graduates of one of the test pilot schools. And now there you get a lot of people that, their life's ambition is to get in space. So, there's some of that. But also, going up once every 3 to 5 years, man, that's a low mission rate.
Yes.
I was really lucky, especially when I left active duty just before I would have been forced into a desk job. So between that and the fact that I was in the National Guard, I got to fly for 29 and a half straight years without having to pull up a headquarters tour, which would not have been possible in active duty. So I got to have a real blast.
Was that a big factor in your choice to join the National Guard, to transfer?
No, it was pretty easy in that direction. It's a little harder to go the other direction from Guard or Reserve to the active duty, but most of the Air National Guard and Air Force Reserve pull their first tour on active duty. And in fact, in the reserves and the Guard, the experience level on the flyers and the maintenance folks is generally at least twice as high as the active duty.
There was a famous former Texas National Guard pilot.
Someone's got some sirens.
That's on my end. I'm sorry. I'll mute.
Okay.
That sounds like New York. Yeah, I was just saying, I read that George W. Bush was a pilot in the same outfit that you flew with.
Yes, he was in that 147th wing that I commanded. Of course, he was there decades before I was.
He didn't ever show up to one of your reunion dues?
No, I was a little disappointed. I wish he would have. There was a lot of interest in how he was back then. From what I saw and heard, he was a typical lieutenant fighter pilot. And I think I met 2 people that who knew him and had been pilots at the same time. And they both said he was a good stick.
He was a good pilot.
The biggest surprise to me is that the bug didn't bite him. Most people, once they've done that, and especially if they've been a fighter pilot, they will never quit. So that's probably my biggest surprise, that he didn't want to continue being a fighter pilot.
Flown in the Royal Air Force, job working for civilian airlines. Did you ever think about taking that route? Jets?
Yes, but particularly as navigator, I would have had to done a lot of civilian training to get a airline pilot license, and it really didn't excite me. I mean, it's pretty routine work. Yes, you're flying, but I have a strong academic interest. So, I left active duty and went to graduate school to get my PhD in geophysics, and was a scientist for a few years.
What was your thesis?
It was in the geothermal energy field. And I did computer modeling of heat and fluid flow in the ground with an interest of figuring out, okay, what are the paths and where should you look for the natural hot water systems that you could put power generation on? Not the house scale geothermal. This is like power plant scale geothermal.
Like in Iceland.
Yes, very much so. In fact, I went there on 2 springs ago for the first time, and I gawked at their geothermal fields and their production facilities.
It's a pretty amazing country, yeah.
It is. I loved Iceland. Be happy to go back there again. most of my work was in the Western U.S., California, Nevada, where there's, I don't know what it is now, maybe some small single-digit percentage of the electrical generation is geothermal energy.
Well, back in the days when you were flying B-52s, did you ever fly over the poles?
Not directly over. I've flown well into the Arctic. And I tell you, particularly back then, pre-GPS, the navigation gets pretty tricky. You have to free up your gyros, and you kind of do an artificial lat-long system called grid, and kind of coast through the real high magnetic latitude area and use your celestial and come out on the other side and then kind of regain all your normal navigation tools. But
you ever see the Northern Lights flying?
Good question. Yep. I've seen them on the B-52's camera systems, because I was in the downstairs compartment. There's no window. So you see the world through a radar scope and a low light TV and an infrared TV. So I've seen it that way. And in fact, one of my reasons for going to Iceland, my wife and I both want to see the Northern Lights, and it was overcast our whole trip. So we've got to go back.
Yeah, you also have to go at a very
I've
specific
seen
time of year, September or March, I think. Yeah.
So maybe we'll get one of those coronal mass ejections, and we'll be able to see them all the way down in Florida or Texas.
That would be awesome.
In some ways. You'd really be able to see them because the grid might be down.
All right. Some pilots also report seeing very interesting weather phenomena, like I think they're called the red sprites. Above, basically, if you're flying at super high elevation above the tops of thunderclouds, you can see plasma effects associated with lightning strikes that, even at commercial aviation altitudes, you can't really see, as far as I'm aware. But I wonder whether you ever did any high altitude flights where you got to see anything strange like that.
Not like that. Seen St. Elmo's fire quite a few times, and that's pretty wild in itself. Where that intense static buildup creates this blue diffuse flame, typically on the front windscreens, and I've never seen
right in front.
It can lead to
right in front of you.
Oh yeah, it'll be just right there. It'll be this glowing blue plasma. And that's quite beautiful.
Cool.
It's a little spooky the first time you see it, but planes are built to generally not have a problem with it.
Have you ever seen anything unexplained?
No, never have.
No. I wasn't
it's one of those
expecting you
things.
to say
UFOs never show up to a trained physicist.
Yeah, right.
or an astronomer. Okay, guys. Well, we've been going for an hour and a half. So I think we'd best leave it there. Thank you so much. Ken,
All right.
thank you
Well,
for
this is
doing
fun.
this.
Thanks. Great questions. Enjoyed it.
So, it's not easy, I don't think, to come on and talk about, especially military matters. It's not an easy thing. So thank you very much.
Well,
Yeah,
I
it
tell
was
you,
very
at some
interesting.
point, it would be nice to come back on and talk about first contact protocols. I've got
I assume that's what you were in Washington, D.C. to talk to the government about, right?
No, it's a separate state government conference.
I was sort of kidding. I don't trust our government to have solid first contact protocols in place yet.
Maybe the
I thought you
commercial
told-
folks and what's that? Starshot.
Yeah, Breakthrough Starshot.
Breakthrough
yeah.
Starshot would be interested in exploring it, but I'm hoping I can get a workshop together at the Tennessee Valley Interstellar Workshop later this year.
Oh, will you be?
To talk about?
I heard about that. Are you going to be attending that conference?
Yeah. I haven't been to it before, but it looks real interesting, and I've submitted a workshop. Hopefully, they'll buy into it.
Interesting.
Yeah, we've had quite a few people on the Unseen Pod from the interstellar movement. We did one show live from the Philadelphia, I think it was. Yeah, it's a great movement. It's a very good thing to be a part of. Success with it. So, and we shall meet up again. Forward to talking about your work on first contact principles. I'm sure our listeners, protocols, I should say. I'm sure our listeners will find that very interesting. This has been the Unseen Podcast, episode 68. And you can find us at unseenpodcast.com or at any good podcasting place like iTunes. Thank you very much and goodbye.
All right. Good night.
Night.